a couple of countries that we don't think about typically when we think about public unrest. Jordan and Morocco both arrested significant numbers of protesters who did not like the onerous measures that their governments were taking. And so it's important to keep in mind that this pandemic certainly has a major health component to it, but also has a very significant political dimension to it in this part of the world. I'll just say that the actual numbers with respect to the virus itself may seem, with the exception of Iran and Israel, and perhaps even Saudi Arabia, may seem rather low. They are. They are, in many cases, significantly undercounted, and in some cases, grossly undercounted. Just take two pretty extreme cases, Iran and Egypt. Iran is now reporting 95,000 confirmed cases of the virus. That's believed to be very significantly underreported, and just over 6,000 deaths. And Iran is a country of, I want to say, around 80, 85 million people. If we look at Egypt, a country whose population is now approaching 100 million, they only report about 5,000 cases and just under 400 deaths. So that kind of gives you, I think, a picture of how undercounted. And therefore, we really can't attest to the numbers that are coming out in terms of the infection rate and deaths due to the lack of testing, monitoring, and reporting. The expectation is, among many, is that we will begin to see these numbers increase very rapidly. In fact, just in the last week or so, we're beginning to see significant increases in Egypt, which you would expect as the most populated, most densely populated country in the Middle East, particularly in cities like Cairo, which is extremely densely populated, and in Alexandria. So that's the first observation that I'll make. The second observation, and this has been pretty amply reported in the media these days, and that is the collapse in global oil prices. And this has had an enormous impact, certainly on the economies of all the countries, both the oil exporters and non-oil exporters of the Middle East, and also in the lives of the citizens of all of these countries. Again, just to take two cases, I mean, Saudi Arabia, probably the wealthiest country in the Middle East, certainly in the Gulf, has reported that just this past month that they ran a $9 billion budget deficit. They were projecting something on the order of about a $30 billion deficit for the whole year. And so it's forcing the Saudis to turn to their reserves to make up the shortfall. And reserves in just 1 month dropped by $27 billion. And they had only anticipated drawing down their reserves this year by $36 billion. So they're already significantly overdrawn when it comes to their foreign exchange reserves, and they're going to have to turn to the credit markets. And they're expecting a significant decline in their GDP this year, with the compensatory or the attendant decline in their budget. And they're already beginning to cut back on a lot of social services. And not surprisingly, they have proposed a ceasefire in Yemen. That civil war there has been eating up billions of dollars on a monthly basis. The other case, of course, where the decline in oil prices has had a pretty severe impact is Iran. The Iranian oil exports, which had already dropped by some 80% after President Trump withdrew from the nuclear accord, have dropped by another 80%. Oil exports for all of the month of March from Iran totaled 80,000 barrels per day, which is a shocking figure for a country that used to export 2.5 billion. This is a function not only of the decline in oil prices and global demand for oil, but also, of course, the American sanctions. And this has imposed very difficult conditions, not only for the government in terms of its management of the economy, but the Iranian people. The Iranians were already facing between 10 and 12% unemployment. That's expected to rise between 15 and 20. Youth unemployment is expected to jump to between 25 and 30%. 40% of small businesses are already stressed or have gone under in the case of Iran, and they are the ones who provide most of the services in that country. So here we see opposite ends of the spectrum in the Middle East, and both suffering pretty acutely. And the third issue I thought I'd highlight, Nader, is what is happening in Israel and in the Israeli-Palestinian situation. As we know, the Israelis, after 3 attempts, had failed to reach a government run by a single party. And so the two contenders, Netanyahu and Gantz, were looking at going to a 4th election, which no one really wanted, and which Gantz felt that his party, the Blue and White Party, would probably lose. And so he did what he swore he would never do, and he formed a joint government. He called it a national emergency government with Netanyahu. Netanyahu will serve as prime minister for the first 18 months, and then Gantz will take up the prime ministry after that. Gantz and his number 2 will probably serve as the foreign and defense ministers respectively, and Gantz will serve as a deputy prime minister. It remains to be seen, actually, whether Gantz will become the prime minister after a year and a half. There are a lot of skeptics out there, and a lot of things, of course, can happen over 18 months. But one of the compromises that Gantz made in this deal was to allow Netanyahu to bring a vote for annexation of areas in the West Bank to a vote in the Knesset, where that vote in all likelihood will win. By annexation, that means that Israel will take formal possession of areas of the West Bank. In all likelihood, they will include the major settlements along the security barrier. That wouldn't surprise many people at all, but would also include major sections, if not all, of the Jordan Valley. And what is interesting to note here is that not only will this enjoy a positive vote in the Knesset, but the majority of Israelis are supporting this today, according to the most recent polls. Outside of Israel, and of course, Palestine, views are quite different. And if there's anything that's going to stop the move toward annexation, it's going to be the U.S. administration. And the U.S. administration is torn on this issue. In the long run, they're strongly in favor of it. It plays to the president's conservative base. But in the short run, it could present some pretty serious difficulties for U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East, and even for the president as he faces election coming up in the fall with some folks who will take, obviously, a much different view toward this issue. So this is going to play out, of course, in the next several months. But nevertheless, I think the U.S. administration is going to be the one that will be the determining factor of whether this goes forward or not.
Great, Gary. Those are observations that actually overlap with my own set of observations on the politics of the Middle East. Just one question for you. You follow the question of oil, global oil prices, I think a bit closer and better than I do. Do you have a sense of, what the forecast is for global oil prices? Because if they stay this low, then obviously it's going to have a huge set of consequences, very negative for the stability of the region and for the stability of many of these authoritarian regimes in the region. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, first of all, because global demand has dropped by 25%, whereas inventories have risen to almost unprecedented levels, it'll take a while to work through those inventories. In fact, one of the reasons that oil has dropped especially low here in the United States and beginning to follow suit in Europe is because of limited storage capacity. That's what drove oil price into negative territory. This is for West Texas Intermediate, just, I don't know, week and a half ago. But increasingly in Asia and in Europe, they're facing the same problem. So low prices are certainly here for the near term, and I would even venture to say for the medium term, simply because it will take the global economy some period of time to rebound and for demand to pick up again. I don't expect prices to, and this is just based on my own inexpert observation and listening and reading to various reports, to reach the $40 to $50 level to well into next year, just because of all of the circumstances that I've just said. And as you said, the economic repercussions are going to be pretty severe, including even in some of the Gulf countries. We're finding that in the smaller Gulf countries like Bahrain and Oman, now looking at major cuts in their budget. And this can have political repercussions, as we all know, because all of these countries provide very, very extensive social services and subsidies for things, everything from healthcare to food. And so how they all deal with this is going to be extremely difficult. I've been, in my particular case, because of my own experiences following Oman, the Omanis are going to face a very difficult problem in turning to credit markets because basically their bonds are rated junk. So they're not going to get any money. The Saudis, of course, will. And the Saudis are going to turn in a major way to credit markets, I think, in the very near future. So low oil prices, and probably some of the folks listening in who may have may have their finger closer on the pulse of the oil sector, but I think the low prices are going to be here for a while.
And Gary, on the question of Iran, where do you stand on lifting sanctions on Iran because of its coronavirus pandemic? There's been a lot of open letters, demands that this is the time when the United States should relax sanctions on Iran because they are suffering a lot of pain due to their pandemic crisis. How do you sort of navigate that question, helping and advancing policies that alleviate human suffering in Iran while not letting the Islamic Republic off the hook for its regional destabilization policies?
I would support personally a lessening of the sanctions on Iran, not because I believe that the Iranian leadership will change its behavior, whether it's in respect to its development of ballistic missiles or to its support for militia groups throughout the region. In fact, we've seen an uptick in the number of attacks against US bases in Iraq by Iranian-backed militia. And we've also seen continued activity on the part of Iranian-supported militia in Syria and Yemen as well. So I don't expect any change in the Iranian behavior, but I think it's important for the United States to send a signal to the Iranian people that we sympathize with them, we support them, and we want to do something to help them. To what extent a lessening of the sanctions will actually reach the Iranian people, I really can't be certain, but I think as a gesture to them, it would demonstrate that we want to be helpful. And if for no other reason, it will show the Iranian people that we are trying to lessen the suffering, which we all know to be considerable because of the pandemic and the economic crisis.
And the other question that sort of has been almost ignored in the mainstream coverage, but I think it's relevant to the Middle East today, is how this pandemic will affect the future and the possible resurgence of radical extremist groups like ISIS and Al Qaeda. Do you have any thoughts on that?
We're already seeing an uptick in both ISIS and Al Qaeda activity in two places that are particularly vulnerable at this time: Syria, from where the U.S. withdrew its most of its forces several months ago, and then of course in Western Iraq. And this kind of a situation is just perfect for extremist groups like Al Qaeda and ISIS. That is to capitalize on attention being diverted away from dealing with those groups to dealing with the crisis du jour, which is the pandemic, and the attendant economic situation. And so we are seeing an uptick there. And of course, they're using the pandemic to bolster their ideological argument that this is somehow a punishment brought on by God for the corruption and the evil, so on and so forth, of the West and all of these governments. And these governments are going to be in a lesser position in terms of their abilities to deal with them. I'm particularly concerned about Iraq, where it is facing this increased pressure from ISIS, and also dealing with the Iranian-backed militia as well. Iraq is being torn in so many directions right now. It has very few resources. They still do not have a prime minister. They're on their third one, attempting to get this man confirmed. It looks like he may get the support of the Iraqi parliament, unlike the previous two. He has a very tall task ahead of him, given the many problems plaguing that country. It's likely that we'll also see an uptick in Al Qaeda activity in Yemen. And then, of course, there's been an increased, if we can use the term, breakdown in the situation in Libya, and that opens that country up again for infiltration from both of those organizations.
Let me share with you some of my thoughts on the Middle East in the age of the coronavirus pandemic, and please pick up on any sort of theme that strikes you as noteworthy to comment on. Generally speaking, I think in the short term, Gary, as you rightly alluded to, this pandemic is a win for authoritarian political actors and authoritarian states. You talked about how Netanyahu benefits from this. I think that's a wider regional trend because the states now, the ruling elites and the states, the state system is now in the name of national security, consolidating power, controlling society, and leading the attempt to deal with this virus. So it's a transfer of power. We can, you rightly alluded to, Gary, also the crushing of these protests that had some promise for bringing about political change in Iraq, in Lebanon, in Algeria, in Sudan, in Egypt, and Iran to a certain extent. Those protests are effectively dead. But they've revived themselves again in Lebanon for reasons that I think are noteworthy and suggest a possible regional trend. You're also right about commenting on the numbers. We don't have, I think, accurate numbers because authoritarian regimes have a deliberate purpose in fudging the numbers to make themselves look good and to not generate public panic. One of the regional trends that I've been paying attention to is the number of people who've been arrested simply for questioning the official narrative on the number of cases and the number of deaths. Just the other day, I read a report that the Islamic Republic, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps openly stated that they arrested 3,600 people for spreading rumors. And spreading rumors basically means, challenging the official narrative of the state on this crisis. And you can see this in Egypt, where, you have a similar crackdown. There was a very good reporter in Egypt for the Guardian newspaper, Ruth Michelson, who was kicked out of the country because she wrote a very detailed analysis of what was happening in Egypt in the early days of this pandemic. And so that gives you a sense of, how authoritarian regimes are using this moment to silence opposition and to consolidate power. But I think one of the bigger sort of broader regional, trends that's worth paying attention to is how this particular pandemic is going to exacerbate existing fault lines in the Middle East that have existed for a very long time between state and society. And the recent protests in Lebanon, which basically are hunger protests, if you read the statements and listen to what people are saying that, look, should we die from the virus or should we die from hunger? We forget that social distancing is a luxury that we have in the West. Many people in the developing world don't have the option of staying at home and to engage in social distancing and not going to work. If you don't go to work, you don't feed your family. And that's exactly what's happening in Lebanon today. And I think the longer this crisis lasts, the longer there's a lockdown, the longer the underlying economic deprivation that many people feel in the region is going to get worse. We know from recent studies, our mutual friend Rami Khouri, based on data from the World Bank and the United Nations Development Program, has written extensively on the theme of how poverty is much wider. Poverty rates are much wider and much higher in the Middle East than previously assumed. 4 times higher than previously existing figures. About 250 million people out of 400 million people in the Arab world, can be classified as poor or vulnerable. And there is this problem of what Rami Khouri calls the mass pauperization in the Middle East that makes it one of the most unequal parts of the world. Even though there's a lot of wealth, a lot of people are poor. Now, without people going to jobs, with falling oil prices that affects the theme of remittances, people who work in the Gulf and send money back home, this is going to, I think, eventually have political consequences for regime stability. Many of these regimes in the Middle East, authoritarian regimes, have grounded their legitimacy on the claim that they're the only ones who can provide stability and security. But if you start to see mass poverty, if you start to see large numbers of people dying, either directly because of the virus or indirectly because of its second order causes, you're going to start to see a lot of regional instability that's going to, in my view, mirror the protests in the Arab Spring. The protests in the Arab Spring were fundamentally, rooted in economic grievances, and then they translated into political grievances. So I think the longer term effects that we're going to see in the Middle East are going to be very destabilizing because of the fundamental economic consequences that flow from this pandemic crisis. So those are my general thoughts, which really overlap with what you said, Gary. So I really haven't said anything new.
No, Nader, I would agree 100% that the government responses to this crisis, both on the healthcare side as well as on the economic side, will largely reaffirm many of the chants that we heard in these demonstrations that have been taking place across the region starting about a year ago, starting with Egypt and Algeria. And once we're through with this, I have no doubt whatsoever that we will see citizens throughout the region taking to the streets again. In fact, I was kind of surprised, and I think you were referring to the same incident in Lebanon. Lebanon, for those who may not be following it, is truly now an economic basket case. It has been brought to its knees through mismanagement and corruption. There were widespread demonstrations throughout the country, many of which had become violent. The government imposed all kinds of restrictions on demonstrations, which typically is not a thing that they've done in Lebanon. It's a relatively more open society there compared to the rest of the region. But they took this action, but things were getting so desperate, as you described, particularly when it comes to food shortages and the inability of people just to access cash, that they took to the streets. The government called out both the army and the police, which they have been very reluctant to do in the past. They had one particular protester who was killed, and that just provoked more demonstrations. And so this is in a period when they're supposed to be under quarantine. The healthcare system, which in Lebanon used to be among the best in the region, is now, like everywhere else, very severely hard pressed. They're even turning away patients, which is, of course, heartbreaking for physicians, nurses, and other healthcare workers who are sworn to take care of people. But they have simply no capacity to deal with them. And so I have no doubt whatsoever that at whatever point when we get through all of this, we will see many people throughout the region back on the street, and probably with much greater enthusiasm, energy, and commitment to see change.
Mm-hmm. No, I totally agree. Let's turn to some questions now and try to answer as many as we can. Let's start with Gina. Gina, do you want to read off the first question?
Okay, so the first question was referring specifically to Egypt and Iran. This person wonders who is actually monitoring the number of hospitalizations and deaths that are occurring in both of those countries.
Gary, do you want to take a crack at that?
The local health authorities. I mean, pretty much all the data that we're getting is coming from local health authorities. There really is there's no independent means really for verifying these figures from these countries, and I think even the WHO to a certain extent, but others certainly not associated with UN organizations or governments have pretty much assumed that these are pretty severely underreported in many of these cases, particularly in the case of Egypt, as I mentioned before.
Yeah, and I would add, it's precisely for that reason why these numbers cannot be trusted, because the official health authorities are controlled by, the existing state apparatus and the ruling elites that are in power, and we know that these regimes have a track record of lying and distortion. In the case of Iran, which I've been following much more closely than Egypt, the official numbers of deaths and cases are clearly an understatement, an underestimation of the true number of figures. And I'm not just talking about, the true number of figures being a function of the inability to have massive testing. I'm talking about a deliberate attempt by the Islamic Republic to downplay the severity of the crisis. And if you follow what's happening in Iran, different elements of the regime are saying contradictory things. Just last week, I read a statement from the municipal authority in the city of Tehran saying that they had dug 10,000 new graves in the main cemetery in Tehran, and this was when the official figures were the official death figures were only 4,000. So they're building grave sites at a much higher rate, suggesting that the true number is much higher, and that's why I think. We have to be skeptical. And this is also, this problem also overlaps with this global conversation and criticism that the World Health Organization has been subjected to. The World Health Organization takes at face value the figures and the numbers that are given to them by member states. And many of those member states are authoritarian, and they have a deliberate reason in trying to distort the true number of cases and deaths. And that's why I think we have to be a little bit skeptical when it comes to taking these numbers at face value. Yeah, how about Nate? You want to go to the next question, Nate?
Yeah, sure. So this one is with regard to the annexation of the West Bank areas and the present U.S. tactics of increasing the pressures on the Palestinians to compromise. Why would the U.S. keep that from happening?
As I said, I think it's largely domestic politics that might constrain this administration. Even among American Jews, there is a considerable difference of opinion about the wisdom of moving forward now with annexation. One of the fears is that if Israel were to move down the road toward annexation, with or without the Jordan Valley. But my own view is that I think they truly intend to include most, if not all, of the Jordan Valley, that it will forever torpedo any chance of the two-state solution. And I'd say not only American Jews, but Americans in general are not willing to give up on that. They see that, in fact, I will personally admit that I see it also as the only way to solve this decades-long crisis or problem. But I don't think that in terms of in Israel, there's much resistance to this politically. In the Arab world, of course, there's considerable. The extent to which, however, Arab governments will communicate their objection to this, particularly some of the Gulf countries who have formed not necessarily formal relationships with Israel, but very important relationships nevertheless. It's not clear how strongly they will come out to object to this. One particular Middle East leader that we do know has already expressed his pretty clear objection to this, and that's King Abdullah in Jordan. Jordan, of course, has a peace agreement with Israel. They have extensive military and security ties with Israel. That peace agreement has worked much better than the one that Israel has with Egypt. And King Abdullah is rightly concerned about the impact that annexation would have in his country, particularly among the majority of the population there, which happens to be Palestinian, and how they will respond if Israel goes forward with this. So a lot of the pressures against the annexation on Israel and specifically on Netanyahu come from the outside, not from inside either Israel. I mean, the Palestinian Authority, it's pretty much a given. Their objection, I mean, they had pronounced the Trump peace plan is dead on arrival, and I think others have pretty much assumed the same thing. But he seems hell-bent for leather to move forward on the annexation. When he tried to do it in February, shortly after the announcement of the plan, the president's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, stepped in and said, now's not the time. And Netanyahu backed off. We'll have to see what happens in July, particularly when it comes up for a vote in the Knesset, which, as I said, I think, where I think it will pass. Will the United States step up? How strongly will other governments, particularly in the Middle East, but also Europe, speak out against annexation?
Yeah, my own view is a bit more critical and cynical. I think from the perspective of Benjamin Netanyahu, the Likud party, and his supporters in the United States, they think this is a perfect opportunity to move ahead with annexation. You have Trump in the White House. You have a Democratic Party that is very cowardly when it comes to doing anything of substance to stop Israeli settlement expansion. You also have, a situation in the Arab world where most of the leading Arab states have effectively, allied themselves with Israel. Privately, they are very close to Netanyahu and his worldview. Publicly, they still sort of articulate the same sort of slogans in support of the Palestinians, but they're not going to, shift policy or do anything of substance to try and stop Israel from annexing more of the West Bank. And then also, I think the global context, I think Netanyahu and his supporters realize that the global pandemic is a perfect opportunity to move ahead, fast forward with their longstanding plan of annexing more land in the West Bank, because the world is distracted by this pandemic. No one's going to stop them. So I don't see any serious obstacles. And of course, the other, obvious point is the Palestinians themselves within the West Bank and Gaza are deeply divided, fractured, broken, effectively a corrupt leadership in the Palestine Authority. So all things look very ripe from Netanyahu's perspective to move right ahead. And I suspect that is exactly what's going to happen. There will be words of protest. There'll be condemnation, but it will be business as usual. That's my prediction. Gina, you want to go to the next question?
The next question is on the same topic. One of our audience members asked that they are hearing that civil society organizations might try to block the unity government in Israel by appealing to the Israeli Supreme Court. Have either of you heard about this, and what do you say about it?
Yes, they are. It's not certain that they are going to succeed, but there are quite a few Israelis who are quite adamant about this government. And about Gantz's decision to join with Bibi. The moment he announced that decision, or at least he made the decision, his blue and white party completely collapsed and is now fractured into, I think, maybe even 3 parties now. And that was probably inevitable. And some of those elements have decided to appeal this unity government to the Supreme Court because of the way they decided to handle it. I'm not familiar enough with Israeli law to say how it might turn out, but there is quite strong opposition to it. And this, of course, is also tied to the outstanding indictments against Netanyahu. I think he has 3 related to corruption. His trial was postponed because of the pandemic crisis in Israel. And is scheduled to begin next month, May, month coming up. We'll see if that actually happens. That could potentially affect it, but my suspicion is that Netanyahu and his party, which is now clearly the strongest party in Israel, again, will push very strongly to get this done.
Nate, you want to read the next question?
Yes. So, is it likely that Oman will turn to Saudi Arabia for money and support? And if they do, would this infringe on its tradition of staying neutral in regional conflicts?
They would probably be very reluctant to do so, but I think they may have to. We'll just have to see. It's not the first time, by the way. During the Arab Spring protests, and they were underreported from Oman, but they actually were quite violent. The Sultan was forced to call out the army to quell demonstrations in a number of the cities. We don't know the death toll. Informally, I've heard that it was over 100, but it got pretty serious. And one of the things that Oman had to do, which it had never done under Qaboos's reign, was to accept grant money of the order of several $1 billion from Saudi Arabia. But it appears as though Oman was able to maintain its independent line on foreign policy, but that was under Qaboos, who was a very unique leader in that country, and in fact, a unique leader for the entire region. His successor, Sultan Haytham bin Tariq, is very new, very vulnerable, stepping in Qaboos's shoes at this very difficult time. And it's not clear that he's going to be able to maintain the same level of independence that his predecessor did. So that remains to be seen. I do know that he's making some tough decisions on reducing services in order to lower the budget. I don't think it's going to be able to meet the severe budget crisis that they're going to be facing throughout this year and well into next year. And so you may have to turn to outside sources, including Saudi Arabia, for help.
Great. Gina, next question.
This one's more of a broad question. Does history have any lessons regarding how a pandemic can shift public tolerance for an authoritarian regime, especially if they fail to contain it and provide for the basic needs of the people, such as food and healthcare?
Nader, what are your thoughts?
No, that's a great question. I mean, one of the things I've been doing while I'm in lockdown is actually trying to look at some of the previous moments in history that can shed light on our contemporary crisis. And of course, everyone now perhaps has heard of the 1918 pandemic. It's sometimes mistakenly labeled as the Spanish flu or the swine flu. And it was a pandemic that actually killed, according to the most conservative estimates, 50 million people around the world. A lot of people also in Asia, in India, and Iran were killed. But in the United States, I was shocked to learn that more people died in 1918 and 1919 as a result of that pandemic than in all of the wars the United States has fought in the 20th century. In other words, if you count the number of Americans who were killed in World War I, World War II, the Korean War, the Vietnam War, the Iraq War, the war in Afghanistan, it's a smaller number than the 675,000 Americans who died roughly 100 years ago. The United States then, the great book on this, actually, if you want to read it, is John Barry's book called The Great Influenza. Now, the United States wasn't an authoritarian regime then, but I think what John Barry teaches us in that book is that different parts of the United States responded differently. He compares in his book the policies of local authorities in Philadelphia with St. Louis. In Philadelphia, they ignored the warnings. The local authorities, planned this massive parade. It was still the final months of World War I, and that led to a huge upsurge in the number of cases and the number of deaths. St. Louis, by contrast, actually did take preventative measures, engaged in social distancing, and the number of deaths in St. Louis was much smaller. But the one key takeaway that John Barry talks about from previous pandemics and lessons of history is the need to tell the truth. If you lie to your population, it creates more chaos. You have to level with them in terms of the dimensions of the problem. You have to try and build up social trust. You have to try and mobilize people in an effective way. If you don't do that, you get chaos and breakdown. And that's exactly what we're seeing today in many authoritarian regimes, particularly in the Middle East. People are not observing social distancing, in large part because they don't believe the statements and the claims of their existing governments, who are corrupt, authoritarian, who repeatedly lie, and who are perceived to be working in the interest not of the society in general, but narrow interests of ruling elites. So I think the big lesson from history, particularly from the 1918 pandemic, and this is not my prescription, it's really one of the key takeaways from John Barry's great book on the topic, is that you have to tell the truth, you have to be honest, you have to engage in as much pre-planning and effective preventative measure as possible. If you don't, things can quickly break down, and you can lead to a massive spike in deaths. So that's the one historical reference that sort of jumps out at me when people raise the topic of the lessons of history from the past that can illuminate our contemporary moment.
Nader, just picking up on your reference to Spanish influenza and how it affected the Middle East. The one case with which I'm familiar is Egypt, where the death toll there, understandably, was extremely high, hundreds of thousands of Egyptians. This is when obviously the Egyptian population was a fraction of what it is today. Mm-hmm. And it did prompt public outcry. And of course, that pandemic came on, in the case of the Middle East, came on top of not only the end of World War I and the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, which ran most of the Middle East, and it led to mass demonstrations in the streets of Cairo and Alexandria and elsewhere in Europe, and brought down the government. So, in fact, it can happen, and I think I don't want to make any predictions, but all of these governments are quite fragile, and they know that. And the one thing that they have done to protect themselves is not be transparent, as you mentioned, Nader, with their publics, not to reach out and to serve their publics, but to crack down with more oppression, more security services. And in Egypt, again, if you look at what Sisi's doing, it boggles the mind. He's announced that he wants to build a new capital city east of Cairo. Construction is ongoing. That capital city is going to cost Egypt which we probably don't need to tell this group today, is not a rich country, $58 billion. Meanwhile, if you go to social media, you can see reports from doctors and nurses actually filmed in the hospitals in Egypt talking about the desperate conditions they're being forced to work under, the absence of resources and so forth. So it's not a leap of faith to believe that once we sort of get through the peak, or the apogee of this crisis, that we are going to see many people in the Middle East take to the streets with far more commitment and energy and verve than we saw in the lead up to the pandemic.
I totally agree with that. I would add another adjective, and anger toward ruling authorities. It's going to be it's going to make the Arab Spring look like a picnic in comparison, against the backdrop of a lot of mass suffering, and then these mega projects that dictators are pursuing when there's very legitimate basic health concerns that people are suffering from. I would completely agree with that observation. Nate, do you have another question for us?
Yes, I do. So this one is, in Lebanon, areas of Iranian influence are being avoided out of fear of coronavirus contamination. Although the largest cluster of coronavirus cases in the country was actually in the Christian areas in the mountains above Beirut. Have there been other examples of sectarian divides being somewhat exacerbated by COVID throughout the Middle East?
Yeah, great question. I'll take a stab at that. In the early days of the pandemic, Saudi Arabia in particular tried to sectarianize the pandemic by claiming that this was a particularly Iranian Shia influence, which had some credibility to it because the epicenter of the virus in the Middle East was in Iran, and a lot of the known cases that we have can be traced back to Iran. Ironically, if you look at the origins of the coronavirus in Iran, they actually trace back to China, and there's a clear link that one can see. So I think you did see in the early days attempts by known sectarian entrepreneurs to try and use this opportunity to sectarianize this conflict, primarily as a way of distracting attention from their own failed policies and rule. But now, I think this crisis has spread beyond simply an easy Sunni Shia distinction and categorization, and so that argument is unsustainable. I didn't know the figures and the facts with respect to Lebanon, that most of the cases in Lebanon now are in the Christian inhabited areas and not in the Shia Muslim part. That doesn't surprise me given the nature of the virus. It doesn't know borders or sectarian divisions. Those are my thoughts on the topic. Gary, do you have anything you want to add?
Just in the case of Lebanon, the Christians of Lebanon tend to be the more affluent, the more active in the business community, and therefore the more likely to come in contact with outsiders who may have had the virus. So that doesn't surprise me. Whereas typically the Shia areas have been, they're just socially a bit different. In terms of social mores in Lebanon itself, but we've also seen the sectarianization of the pandemic in places like Iraq. We've heard complaints from predominantly Kurdish and Sunni Muslim areas of lack of attention, although quite honestly, given the paucity of resources in that country, I'm sure everyone has pretty firm ground to stand on in Iraq when they complain, but they have accused the government of sectarianizing the pandemic. Nader, you mentioned Saudi Arabia, and there are reports that the Shia Saudis, which make up almost 2 million of their population, are not getting the same level of medical attention that the Sunnis may be receiving. Similarly, in Bahrain, a majority of whose population is Shia. Interestingly, Saudi Arabia and Bahrain almost immediately blamed the pandemic in their respective countries on Iran, whereas countries like Kuwait, the UAE, and Oman were more circumspect, even though in all likelihood they initially contracted the virus through contacts with Iranians as well. But they recognize that you're not going to contain a virus. It knows no boundaries, whether geographic or sectarian or ethnic or religious or anything else. And they sought ways to mitigate not only the conditions in their own country, but the conditions in Iran too. In the case of Kuwait and Qatar actually providing some aid to Iran.
On that point, Gary, one of the interesting developments that I wanted to get your thoughts on is it seems to be that the United Arab Emirates has broken with Saudi Arabia in terms of an outreach to Iran, sending aid, trying to patch up differences, which raises questions about, the future of the Gulf Cooperation Council. Am I reading too much into those gestures that you alluded to, particularly the outreach and the dialogue between the UAE and Iran, in contrast to Saudi Arabia's much more hawkish position?
No, not at all. I think the UAE is beginning to find a way, has already begun actually to find a way to make its peace with Tehran. I think they see it as in their own interests, and every country, of course, ultimately will act in its own interest. And where I see this particularly playing out right now, Nader, is in Yemen.
Right.
The Saudis, of course, as I mentioned, called for a ceasefire about a week and a half ago. And this is when they clearly know now that they are not going to win this war. But the UAE had withdrawn all of its forces. They had sided with the Saudis in that conflict since 2015. Mm-hmm. They withdrew their forces from Yemen about 6 months ago. And now, interestingly, have voiced their support for this separatist movement down in the south, the Southern Transition Council, or I believe it's called, which is entirely Sunni, and they are no longer working with the government that was backed by Saudi Arabia. When I say they, I'm talking about these Yemenis in the Southern Transition Council. So now we have a three-front conflict in Yemen. We sort of always had that, but now it's clearly more apparent. The UAE is backing away from supporting the Saudis and is putting all of its weight behind this southern front. So it's another demonstration where the UAE and Saudi Arabia are choosing to go their own ways. But the Yemen issue is really the big one. And that's just simply because it's in the Emiratis' interest to do that. Not unlike the Omanis and the Kuwaitis, by the way.
Mm-hmm. Let's take one more question, Gina, and then we'll start to wrap it up.
Okay, the last question is also about Iran. Do you expect that the same old approach of, quote, helping Iranian people while keeping the regime under pressure, do you think it is feasible or useful? Wouldn't it undermine Iran's ability to fight the pandemic? How does this add to the instability in the region and the opportunity for ISIS and other extremist groups to take advantage?
Well, I don't think there's been very much U.S. government help for the Iranian people. I think they're the biggest actually victims in this clash between the United States and the Islamic Republic of Iran. I think the net effect of Trump's hawkish foreign policy on domestic Iranian politics is that, contrary to the claims of Trump's supporters, is that these hawkish policies actually strengthen hardline forces in Iran, strengthen the regime overall, and weaken the middle class, weaken the opposition, weaken civil society. So it's having the exact opposite effect. You can clearly see that, and I could spend a couple of hours going through the documentary record. So overall, I think it's a policy that is not going to affect the regime's fundamental stability, although they are under pressure, because of the sanctions and because of the regional discontent. But I don't see this, the Islamic Republic falling or toppling anytime soon because of what Pompeo and Donald Trump are doing to it. The effects on, I don't think what's happening internally in Iran have any direct relationship to the rise of ISIS. I think those are separate sort of themes and trends in the region. Gary?
No, pretty much. I think the same thing. I see really no possibility of either side sort of pulling back from their pretty much hardline positions, whether it's the United States and the position of the Trump administration or the Iranian leadership. The United States had announced that they had worked out a financing facility so that the Iranians could access financing in order to purchase medicines and other humanitarian items easily on the international market. And the Iranians decided to ignore that gesture. By the way, this was worked through the government of Switzerland and a number of banks in Switzerland. Most international banks are very, very reluctant, of course, to lend money to Iran under any circumstances for fear of coming under U.S. sanction authority. But the U.S. had made this special facility available, and the Iranians chose not to avail themselves to it, which I think is illustrative of the very strong lines that both sides have drawn in this conflict, not willing to budge 1 inch. And that's going to continue, certainly for the foreseeable future under this administration.
Mm-hmm. So on that sad and pessimistic note, I want to thank everyone who tuned in to be part of this Zoom sort of public conversation, open forum on the Middle East in the age of the coronavirus pandemic. Thanks to you, Gary, for your participation. Thanks to Gina and Nate for helping out with the questions. I hope everyone is safe. I hope everyone stays safe and secure. We do have another event similar to this one that will focus exclusively on the Israel-Palestine conflict, what's happening in the Palestinian occupied territories next month with our visiting scholar Hassan Ayub. Similar format. You can find more details out from our website. Thank you all for being with us, and see you again.